I'm not gonna waste time giving One Piece an introduction, since if you clicked on this video, you know what it is. Chances are you also probably fall into one of two camps: someone who's genuinely curious about whether or not the series is worth your time, or someone who's a huge fan of One Piece and wants to know what somebody who just got through reading it thinks about it. With this video, I'm gonna do my best to thread the needle and make both groups happy. For the sake of making it accessible, I'll keep what I say limited to general thoughts for the most part, and if I have to go into spoiler territory for the sake of being thorough, I'll give a clear warning beforehand and tell you where to skip ahead. Now, to answer the big question, or at least to give a short answer up front, yeah, I think it was worth it, but your mileage may vary. Me personally, I'm really glad I caught up, but it's not like it was a free and easy process. One of the things One Piece is most well known for, after all, and the number one reason most people choose not to start it, is its length. If you want to become a One Piece fan, you've got to part ways with 100+ hours of your time, and there's no way around that. No matter how you choose to consume it, it's long. I read the manga, which is a significantly faster option than watching the anime, and it still took me a little over a month. When I tweeted that I'd read One Piece from start to finish in this period of time, there were a couple people saying things like, oh, those are rookie numbers, oh, this isn't really that impressive, I read it faster, but the general consensus was that this was unusually fast. I started on the 1st of January, and initially wasn't moving through the series that quickly, but around the 10th or so, I decided I was going to read at least 3 volumes every day. Some days I read a little more, and on my second to last day reading the series, I read about 9 volumes, so throughout the entire month of January and the very beginning of February, I was spending anywhere from 2 to 5 hours every day just reading One Piece. If you decide to watch the anime, and God forbid, don't skip any of the filler, it's going to take you a lot longer than a month. There are fan projects like One Piece Kai and One Pace that you can use to accelerate the process of getting through the anime, but neither one is finished yet, so you'll have to mix and match between the anime and whichever one of these you choose to watch if you decide to go this route. Regardless, it's going to take you a while. There's no shortcut or easy way to catch up on One Piece. If you want to see what all the hubbub's about, you're just going to have to put the time in, and while I personally felt like my time was well spent with the series, obviously, you might not end up feeling the same way. I didn't feel the same way when I first gave the series a try about 6.5 years ago. I got like 170 chapters in, thought this isn't good enough to justify the time I'm gonna have to invest into the rest of the series, and dropped it. I was pretty convinced I was gonna feel the same way when I started it again this year, actually. I was especially pessimistic because I had to start from scratch when I picked it back up last month. By then, I'd pretty much completely forgotten everything that happened in the first 170 chapters. I remembered some key moments here and there, but when I picked up from where I'd left off, I didn't recognize plenty of the characters, and I was just like, okay, I need to start all the way over. The main thing that was different this time was that I was actually determined to finish the series, so I was forced to be a lot more patient with it. Believe me though, I understand where you're coming from if you're skeptical. Like I said, I was the exact same way even as I was reading it up until a certain point. Setting my enjoyment of the series aside for a second, I think One Piece's biggest selling point is how much fun it is to talk to people about it. I'm really glad to be caught up now, not just because it comes with a huge sense of accomplishment, but also because One Piece discourse is awesome. It's hard to prove this, obviously, and considering how long the series is, I don't blame you if you don't want to take my word for it, but if you have any friends asking you to watch One Piece, it's probably because they want to talk to you about it, so I think you should indulge them. There's so much to discuss with One Piece. Even parts of the series that I didn't particularly enjoy reading introduced some of my favorite points of conversation with my friends. If you don't have any friends who are active One Piece fans, but you have somebody who's willing to start it with you, I think that's just as good. Whether you have people to discuss the series with or not, though, what you're probably most interested in is if you'll enjoy it. That question doesn't have a catch-all answer, at least not a concise one, so the rest of this video is going to be a full series review. There's plenty of stuff I probably won't cover because of how long One Piece is, but I'll do my best to touch on everything I consider important and satisfy your curiosity whether you're a fan or a potential newcomer. The first thing I'll say is that this was not a consistent experience. One Piece definitely has its moments, but it also has its fair share of low points, and I found that they often end up right next to each other. To give you an example of this, the Enies Lobby arc, which covers chapters 375 to 430, and the Sabaody arc, which covers chapters 490 to 513, are considered by most of the One Piece fandom to be 2 of the best arcs in the series. Enies Lobby specifically is one of the 2 most popular choices for the best arc in One Piece. Now, if you're a One Piece fan, you probably already know what I'm about to say, and if you're not, you may have noticed that there's roughly an arc-sized gap between these 2 arcs. The 48 chapters in between cover Thriller Bark, often cited as one of the worst arcs in One Piece. In fact, to a lot of people, it is the worst arc in One Piece. This isn't the only example of this, by the way, and I don't mean that there's like, oh, there's another good arc followed by a bad arc. I mean, like, the quality disparity is just as extreme as the example I just described. Aside from Enies Lobby, the other arc that you'll typically see people claim as their favorite is Marineford. If it's not their favorite, in 99% of the cases, cases I've seen, it's in their top 5, if not their top 3. This arc is almost immediately followed by Fishman Island, which is, yes, also widely considered one of the worst arcs in One Piece. Typically, people think it's about the same as, a little bit better than, or a little bit worse than Thriller Bark. This doesn't just apply to the arcs themselves either. Even within the same arc, there can be a vast spike in quality from one chapter to another. Thriller Bark is another good example of this, actually. I wasn't super into most of it, but I thought that the beginning was solid and the end was incredible. I won't spoil what happens, but the end of Thriller Bark has one of what's probably my top 5 favorite scenes in the series, and I still consider it one of One Piece's worst arcs. I somewhat frequently flipped between not being able to stop myself from turning to the next page to having to force myself to turn to the next page. This isn't just in regards to Thriller Bark, by the way. I'm talking about the whole series when I say this. Some days I was having a blast, other days I was just doing my job, and there were plenty of days that were a mixture of both. The experience was definitely a positive one overall, but if I hadn't committed to finishing the series this time, there are multiple points where I probably would have dropped it. Now, I'm not necessarily saying this as like a dig at One Piece, so I mean, inevitably it's gonna come off that way, but I'm actually trying to do the opposite. If you're anything like me and you try to start the series, like I said, if you're skeptical, I understand, but the joke about how it gets really good after like 400 chapters isn't like inaccurate, so I am really glad that I stuck with it. I kind of want to keep this next part to myself because I really want to make a video ranking every arc in One Piece from worst to best at some point after this, but to give everyone a general idea of where I stand on different portions of the series, which I do think is important because if you're a fan of One Piece, you're going to want to know what my favorite arcs were, and if you're just getting into One Piece, you're probably going to want to know when the series gets really good. Here's a quick series overview arc by arc. I will be referencing each arc by name, and if you haven't started the series yet, those names are almost certainly meaningless to you, but I'll have text on screen showing which chapters each arc covers so I can give you a general idea of which arcs to look forward to and which arcs to brace yourself for. I thought East Blue, which covers the first 100 chapters of the series, was generally pretty good, but it's also a prime example of the consistency issue I was talking about just a second ago. To be fair though, that's because East Blue isn't really an arc, it's more like a collection of smaller arcs. It's basically a prologue to the rest of One Piece. Many members of the core cast are introduced in these first 100 chapters, and every time someone new joins Luffy's crew, the process gets its own dedicated arc. So East Blue can actually be split apart into Romance Dawn, Orange Town, Syrup Village, Barati, Arlong Park, and Rogue Town. In its totality though, it's not that much longer than some of One Piece's later arcs, and it's actually quite a bit shorter than one of them, so some people like to consider it one story arc rather than 6. No matter how you look at it though, I think East Blue generally gets better the deeper into it you get. The only exception really I think is Romance Dawn. I think it's better than both Syrup Village and Orange Town, but I think Barati's better than all 3 of them, Arlong Park is better than that, and Rogue Town is even better than that. Now for those of you who haven't seen the series yet, I'm not sure if this is the exact general consensus or not, since most people I've seen seem to think that Arlong Park is the best arc out of East Blue, but pretty much everyone also likes Rogue Town, so regardless, most people will tell you that the best portion of East Blue is the end. It's weird because all of these arcs aside from Rogue Town use the same overall narrative structure, but some just do it better. Arlong Park works so well because it takes the same template that was used for all of the arcs before it and adds in a really cool plot twist in addition to plenty of great character moments. It also has the second best villain in East Blue, Arlong, right behind Buggy from Orange Town. Speaking of the villains, I think that's probably one of the weaker aspects of East Blue. It definitely has some good villains, don't get me wrong. Alvida, Buggy, and Arlong are all pretty good. But the others, Higuma, Morgan, Captain Kuro, and Don Krieg, especially Captain Kuro, aren't very good. Where Oda really excels in this section of One Piece is with the protagonists. All of them are likable and compelling, and the process of watching Luffy convince each of them to open up their hearts and eventually join his crew is great, every single time. These first 100 chapters didn't like blow my mind or anything, but they were good enough that I felt compelled to continue reading, especially after Rogue Town. With just 5 chapters, it establishes a lot of forward momentum for the story, introduces some really cool characters and plot threads, and even brings back some characters that I wasn't ever expecting to see again. As for the rest, I think it has a really solid intro, but once you hit chapter 8, on a chapter-by-chapter basis, it can go from being really engaging to pretty boring and unremarkable, but starting with, if not Barati, then definitely Arlong Park, Oda really hits a stride where pretty much every aspect aspect of the series is at least good. The pacing in Arlong Park sometimes for like a second hits a snag, but never for long enough to seriously hurt my enjoyment. Even at times where I didn't find the story or action particularly engaging, or for whatever other reason I just found the series was slogging along, One Piece's core cast of characters is so good and so likable that I felt compelled to keep reading anyway just to find out what happens to them. This applies to pretty much all of One Piece though, not just to East Blue, and it's really good that that's the case because the next portion of the series, the Alabasta saga or Baroque Work saga, depending on what you want to call it, is all over the place. It's about as long as East Blue at 117 chapters, but is way more inconsistent in terms of pace and quality. It's another prime example of One Piece's consistency issues, perhaps the prime example actually. Like with East Blue, this portion of the series can be split into multiple smaller arcs, those being Reverse Mountain, Whiskey Peak, Little Garden, Drum Island, and Alabasta. There are things I like about all 5 of these arcs, but they also all have at least 1 or 2 fairly serious issues. One issue that One Piece as a series has is that frequently its pacing will just completely fall off a cliff. Oda's definitely capable of pacing the series well, and the reason I know this is because there are plenty of times where he's pulled it off. I also think that when he wants to be, he's really good at establishing a sense of momentum and convincing me that the series is really going somewhere, and for whatever reason, sometimes he'll just choose to throw it in the trash and bring everything to a screeching halt. It's not always that bad, sometimes things just slow down a little bit, like for example in East Blue, there's an arc where Luffy comes face to face with the villain of that arc. But before they can fight, he gets trapped in a cage. Now I was thinking, okay, there are plenty of ways that this can be resolved, because first of all, Luffy had some crewmates at this point, so I was thinking maybe they'll fight some of this villain's henchmen and steal the key from them, then get Luffy out of the cage and he'll fight the main villain. There is also a cannon on top of the roof that maybe the villain would shoot at Luffy while he was in the cage, and surprise, surprise, the cage blows up, but because Luffy's made out of rubber, the cannonball would like bounce off, like whatever, right? You know, something like that. This type of approach stops Luffy from immediately solving the problem without seriously hurting the pace of the story. It gives Oda the ability to flesh out the villain a bit before Luffy fights them, and also ensures that the other protagonists have an active role in the story while still keeping things moving along at a brisk pace. That is not how he chose to approach the situation though. Instead, what happens is the cage with Luffy still inside gets taken off of the roof and moved all the way across town, and then one of Luffy's crew says, hey, I stole the key, so we're all good, I'm gonna get you out of there. But then a dog eats the key to the cage, which gives one of the villain's crew enough time to show up, and then the member of the crew just has a giant lion at their disposal, like that's how they fight, and the lion destroys the cage and Luffy gets out anyway. Then Luffy has to fight this lion guy, then go all the way back to where the main villain is, and it just felt like a waste of time. I get if this sort of thing doesn't bother you, but I can't stand it. I hate spending time with a story, actively engaging with it, and feeling like I'm not making any progress towards the end, or at least towards the next big interesting story moment, and that's how I felt here, like we were back at square one in the exact same position we were in when the encounter started. It's not horrible, it's not like this isolated instance of something like this is the difference between me giving an arc a 10 out of 10 and giving it a 7 out of 10 or anything like that, but when it happens a lot, especially when examples of it are particularly close together, it can be exhausting. This type of thing is fairly common in One Piece, and to be fair, sometimes there's a reason for it. In the example I just gave, Oda seems aware that he's taking a detour from the main plot and takes advantage of it, and I won't spoil how, I'll just say that the dog that eats the key is actually fairly plot relevant. Now, having said that, I don't always think these detours are worth it. Sometimes they are. There's an example of that in the Baroque Work saga that I'll talk about here in a minute. But oftentimes, whenever Oda takes a break from whatever's currently in focus to give Luffy or whoever else the opportunity to interact with some townspeople or find out more about a given location, I come away from it feeling like I would have just preferred to continue on with the main story. I just think that Oda could be a more efficient writer, I guess. And again, if you don't agree or this doesn't bother you, I get it. I'm not here to argue with you because it's a personal preference thing. Now, the reason I said all of that is because this sort of thing is probably my biggest problem with the Baroque Work saga. It's particularly annoying here because this portion of the story establishes fairly early that it's building towards an ultimate climax, but it feels like it takes forever to get there. Even my favorite arc of the 5 that make up this saga is a side quest that doesn't really have anything to do with the overarching Alabasta narrative. Interesting stuff happens all throughout this part of the story to be sure, but there's always always dead time between those highlights. With Little Garden, for example, there are these two giants that live there, and I thought they were awesome. I was really interested in everything that had to do with them. And then right after they get introduced, there is this horrible, terrible, awful, boring, really, really needlessly long fight that happens that I was just miserable reading through. Speaking of the villains, I'm not a fan of most of the villains that show up throughout this point in time. I don't really like anyone in Baroque Works aside from, just to make sure this is spoiler-proof, I'll call them Miss All Sunday and Mr. Zero. Mr. 2 is also pretty good, and Mr. 3 eventually grew on me, but everybody else in Baroque Works, they didn't really do it for me. Drum Island also has a pretty good villain, but the standouts here, the ones who really carry this part of the story on their back, are Mr. Zero and Miss All Sunday. Once the crew actually makes it to Alabasta, I think things get a lot more interesting, except when they're not. I think the Alabasta arc has some really high highs, but dude, when it's boring, it's boring. Sometimes things get a little confusing as well. Oda hops back and forth between perspectives in a way that I didn't find particularly intuitive to read, and I think that this arc places too much focus on side and background characters who I ultimately didn't end up caring about at all. Your mileage may vary, of course, none of this may end up bothering you, but I thought Alabasta was pretty messy. I want to stress, though, that when it's good, it's really, really good. Here we get some incredible fights, interesting world building, and compelling character moments, and the sense of character growth and progress that I felt by the end of Alabasta was easily unmatched by anything that came before it. Baroque Works isn't like horrible, but it has a lot of the same problems as East Blue without the same number of indicators that you as a reader are making progress. With East Blue, you're constantly getting introduced to core characters and series concepts, and that doesn't happen nearly as often in Baroque Works. While I don't think this was the worst part of the series, it was the hardest part for me to finish. Drum Island and Whiskey Peak were great, and the high points of Alabasta were better than anything in those two arcs, but this part of the series definitely has its problems. If you can stick with it till the end of Alabasta, then I think you've got what it takes to finish the rest of One Piece. Jaya, which happens right after Alabasta, was where the series really picked up for me. I think that this was by far the best arc in the series at the time it happened. It makes it very clear how far Luffy's come since the start of the series, and like I said earlier, I personally consider that sense of growth really valuable. It's one of my favorite parts of engaging with any long-form story. Like Rogue Town, this is also where a lot of new characters and concepts make their first appearance, and where some characters get reintroduced or formerly introduced concepts get expanded upon. The ending portion of Jaya had me a little bit too excited about people just showing up and basically standing still. I genuinely don't mean that as a dig at the series either. If you've read Jaya, you should know what I'm talking about, and if you haven't yet, you'll know when you get there. One issue I had with Jaya, probably the only major issue I have with the arc, is how it handles its core theme. Jaya's not the only arc that I have this kind of problem with, and it's actually not the first arc in One Piece that I have this kind of problem with either. To use an early, pretty much spoiler-free example of this, one of the first antagonists in the series, Captain Morgan, is very one-dimensional. The thing that Oda's trying to illustrate with the character is a sort of takedown of the might makes right philosophy. Morgan basically exists to show that it's wrong to misuse a position of power, and having a position of power isn't necessarily the same as deserving it. This isn't necessarily a bad theme, but I don't think One Piece explores it in a thoughtful way. Morgan says constantly, and I mean constantly, many times, that his rank entitles him to do and say whatever he wants. The message is made clear long before Oda stops making arguments for why you should agree with it. By the end of the arc, I couldn't help but find it a little annoying. This isn't a deal breaker for me or anything. I don't think it's unacceptable, but I'm not fond of it, and it happens pretty often in One Piece. Jaya probably wasn't the worst example of this in the series, but it was a particularly bad one. The theme is repeated verbatim through dialogue without any subtlety, analogies, or metaphors over and over and over again. It wasn't enough to ruin the arc for me, not even close. As of now, Jaya is my fourth favorite arc in One Piece, but this was something I felt I should mention. While I'm on the subject of how One Piece handles themes, I want to stress that I don't think it's all bad. Sometimes Oda's clumsy in his execution with them, but generally the themes in One Piece, at least past Alabasta, are pretty interesting. Early on, One Piece is thematically simple, and the way that these themes are tackled is typically pretty straightforward. But past the point that I'm talking about now, things get significantly more complex. arcs, and even when Oda's not implementing and exploring these themes in the way that I'd prefer he did, there are still plenty of times where I appreciate what he's trying to say. One Piece has a lot to say about serious real-world issues, like racism and how the oppressed interact with their oppressors, or the power and prevalence of weaponized information and disinformation, particularly how these things can be used by and how powerful they are in the hands of political institutions like national governments, or in One Piece's case, the world government. One of the core themes of the next arc after Jaya, Skypia, is the long-term effects of colonialism. Skypia is a controversial portion of One Piece. As far as I can tell, I think the majority of One Piece fans don't like it or consider it one of the series' weaker arcs, but it definitely has a fan base, and I think I'd include myself in it. I'm not sure. Maybe I was just in a really good headspace when I was reading Skypia, because thinking about it, there are definitely things in it that I could see really annoying me if I had read it while I was in a bad mood. But I don't know, man, I thought it was a good time. I think my favorite thing about it is that, at least at first, it deviates fairly significantly from the typical story structure that Oda uses for the arcs before it. At the risk of simplifying things a bit too much, most of the arcs in One Piece up to this point are the same story with a different coat of paint. The notable exceptions, in my opinion, are Rogue Town and Jaya. I already said this in the East Blue section, actually. Some of the arcs use this narrative structure better than others, but Skypia was the first one that pretty much completely broke off from it and tried to do something else. The biggest issue I have with it is that at the time it happens, it's pretty disconnected from everything around it. Like Drum Island, it feels like more of a side quest than part of the main story, but I think that the location is really interesting. It's hard for me to put my finger on it exactly, but I think that there was just enough that I wanted to find out about Skypia to keep me from being put off by this. Eventually, particularly by the climax, the arc does start to feel reminiscent of all of the other arcs in One Piece, especially because the threat posed to the protagonists and the objective of the protagonists at the end of Skypia is pretty much the same as it is at the end of Alabasta. I'm not talking about Luffy fighting the bad guy, that's kind of a given, but there's a specific thing that the bad guy tries to do towards the end of both arcs that Luffy has to stop to save a bunch of people, and I'm not going to say what it is for the sake of avoiding spoilers, but I will say that it's quite a bit cooler when it happens in Skypia. There's way more of a spectacle to it when Enel does it than when Mr. Zero does it. Speaking of Enel, he's great. I don't know if I like him more than the main villain of Alabasta, but he is one of my favorite villains in One Piece. He's really cool, and I mean like really, really cool. His henchmen are like whatever. I'm not super fond of them. I don't even remember any of their names, actually. But Enel himself, oh man, he's awesome. Pretty much all of what I'm about to say also applies to the main villain of Alabasta, but he's extremely charismatic, and he feels overwhelmingly powerful, even compared to all of the antagonists that come before him. It actually took me a minute to figure out how Luffy was supposed to even fight this guy, much less beat him, but then I realized that there's a certain way that his power should interact with this guy's power, and when it clicked with me, it put a big dumb smile on my face. I felt a little bit stupid. I felt like I should have figured this out sooner, but I think it's really clever on Oda's part, because Enel's power makes sense for him. That's what I would have picked for him as well if I was the person who created him. Considering the sort of person he is, the way he acts, the aura he has about him, and what he's supposed to represent, the power that Oda chose to give him is perfect. It also happens to interact with Luffy's power in a very specific and entertaining way. I won't say any more than that, because if you've read One Piece, you know what I'm talking about, and if you haven't, I'd like for you to see for yourself. This arc also follows up on a plot point introduced in Alabasta that I was particularly interested in, and in doing so further sets up what's, in my opinion, one of the most intriguing parts of One Piece's world. Skypia is not perfect, and whether you like it or not, I mean, like, it really depends on you, honestly. What I'll say is that I enjoyed it, but I wasn't surprised, like, at all when I went online and saw that a bunch of people hated it. The next arc after Skypia is Long Ring Longland, and I think I was just in a really, really good mood when I was reading Skypia and this part of the story, because I didn't hate it. Like, if I were to rank every arc in One Piece, this one would probably be close to, if not at the bottom. But I had fun going through it. Like, I really didn't hate it. If it lasted longer than it did, that would probably not be true. But it's not that long. The best way I can sum it up, though, is to say that it is the most filler but actually in the manga arc I've ever read in my entire life. The ending is really cool, though. There's an interaction at the end of the arc that really hooked me and made me super excited to start reading the next arc, Water 7. Water 7's really good. Better than Alabasta, better than Skypia, but I don't think it's better than the Peaks of East Blue. It has a really strong start, a great atmosphere, and like Skypia, a unique narrative structure for a One Piece arc. My main issue with it is that it gets pretty cluttered and awkward towards the end, but pretty much every arc in One Piece has a section that's cluttered and awkward. I'll talk about that some more later, though, in a section of the video I want to dedicate to how I feel about the series as a whole. I want to get to that soon, by the way, since this is a video about whether or not you should watch One Piece and not how good every arc in One Piece is. So I'm not going to cover all of the following arcs with the level of detail I covered East Blue, Alabasta, and Skypia with. What I'm about to talk about is the most important part of the series anyway. See, the best thing I can say about Water 7 is that it does a decent job setting up the next arc, Enies Lobby, which is, in my opinion, hands down the best arc in One Piece. My opinion of One Piece before I started reading Enies Lobby was that I liked it, but I wasn't a huge fan or anything like that. By the end of Enies Lobby, I had been completely converted. This arc has the best pacing in One Piece, some of the best fights in One Piece, some of the best character moments and character development in One Piece, some of the best world building in One Piece. Pretty much anything that you'd be looking to get out of a good story is here in Enies Lobby. If you've made it this deep into the video but haven't started One Piece yet, I'd say chances are you're a fairly patient person, and I know there's a huge difference between watching 25 minutes of a video and reading or watching 400 chapters worth of One Piece. But seriously, if you're at all interested in picking One Piece up and you have the time to do this, stick with it until the end of Enies Lobby. I'm as close to certain as I can possibly be that you won't regret it. The final fight of this arc was the moment that fully convinced me to stick with One Piece until the very end. Like, I'd already committed to doing that when I started the series for the sake of making a video like this, but after Enies Lobby, I really wanted to finish One Piece for its own sake. There may be a few other points before this arc that do this for you. Some people get hooked right from the beginning. Some people say Arlong Park is the moment where they fell in love with One Piece. Some people say that it was Alabasta. Some people say it's Water 7. It really depends on you, but I think that if you can get to Enies Lobby and still not like One Piece, you're probably the sort of person who wasn't even interested in starting One Piece in the first place. Now, to quickly provide my thoughts on each of the following arcs, I already talked about Thriller Bark a little bit, and my main issue with it isn't necessarily that it's boring, but that it's long. A lot of people call it filler bark, for good reason, I think, because most of it doesn't feel particularly necessary. It introduces a handful of important characters, including one new member of the main cast, and gives an existing member of the main cast one of their best character moments. It also follows up on a fairly important plot point from earlier in the series, so it does do some things that matter, but so much of it feels like fluff. A lot of the same can be said about Long Ring Longland, but at least that arc is short. Thriller Bark is like 50 chapters, bro, and following up Enies Lobby with this, like, come on, Oda. Something else I also talked about earlier is that the arc right after Thriller Bark, Sabaody, is one of my favorites in the series. It's, I think, my third favorite, right behind Marineford, which happened shortly after it. Sabaody feels fast-paced, open-ended, intense, and unpredictable in a way that few other One Piece arcs do. It also introduces a ton of key story elements, typically in a very exciting way. While I was reading Sabaody, I always felt like something important was happening. The next arc, Amazon Lily, surprisingly manages to maintain the momentum established by Sabaody. It also introduces one of my favorite characters in the series and leads into another really good arc, Impel Down. I don't know how to talk about Impel Down in any amount of detail without spoiling it, so I'll just say that this was one of the most rewarding parts of One Piece for me. It's maybe a little longer than it needs to be, but it's a lot of fun, and it reintroduces a lot of my favorite characters, and characters I didn't even like previously, but I think this arc made me come around on. The next arc, Marineford, is totally insane. It's my second favorite arc in One Piece, and by a fairly wide margin too. I think that the 4-arc run of Sabaody, Amazon Lily, Impel Down, and Marineford is the best stretch in all of One Piece. If this had come right off the back of Enies Lobby, not Thriller Bark, or maybe even a shorter Thriller Bark, oh my goodness, it would have been so perfect. It would have been immaculate. Anyway, Marineford is in contention for the arc responsible for the most world building in the entire series. It constantly hits you with new characters and ideas, all in the middle of some of the coolest set pieces in shonen. There are like 50 billion insane things that happen back to back to back to back to back. The pacing here is wonderful. Pretty much every character to make an appearance here is at their best, if not close to their best, and it really opens up the world of One Piece. Fishman Island has a strong start and a strong finish, but a really really lackluster middle portion. Pretty much the entire second act is really messy, but I had a lot of fun with the beginning and the end. Punk Hazard is divisive. I really like it, but typically when I say that I really like it, especially when I say how much I like it, people raise an eyebrow at me, so I don't know, maybe set your expectations low just so you don't get disappointed. And if you end up enjoying it, you'll be pleasantly surprised. Dressrosa is basically Alabasta 2, like A New Hope, Force Awakens levels of similar. Like Alabasta and also Fishman Island, I think that the first act and the third act are awesome, and the second act is not good, if not straight up bad. The pace is extremely inconsistent, and the low points are... they're low points for sure, but the high points I think more than make up for it. Like with Alabasta as well, this arc has a phenomenal main villain, one that, unlike Alabasta, doesn't completely carry the arc on his shoulders, but does a lot to elevate the arc simply by existing and being one of its focal points. Whole Cake Island is apparently also divisive, which I was surprised to hear because I thought it was spectacular. It definitely has its problems, but I think that it's set in one of the most interesting locations in the series, has one of the most interesting main antagonists in the series, and has some of the best fights in the series. I don't know, this is another Punk Hazard situation where I'd say, based on how I've seen other people say they feel about this arc, my experience with it might not reflect yours. The next arcs, Zoe, Reverie, and Wano, are all pretty good. I'll save how I feel about them for another video, especially Wano, because that arc is 150 chapters long, and from what I've seen, people are highly opinionated about it. I think it's best saved for its own video. I'll also say that current One Piece is really good, probably the best it's been since the time skip. So if you're watching this video close to the time it was uploaded, there's never been a better time to get into One Piece than right now, I think. Now finally, here in the last section of the video, I want to talk about how I feel about One Piece as a whole, things that more or less apply to the entire series. So first, let's start with characters. To the surprise of no one, the 1,000+ chapter manga series with a reputation for extensive world building has a lot of them. There are also plenty of different character archetypes present in One Piece, which for the most part I think are well represented, so no matter who you are and no matter how you feel about the rest of the series, I think that you'll find at least one character that really resonates with you. Oda doesn't score a home run with every single one of his characters, but I think he manages to where it counts. Many of the side characters are pretty boring and forgettable, sure, but pretty much everyone important is well characterized and likable. One issue I have with the series is that Oda tends to focus on these side characters a little more than I think he should, sometimes a lot more than I think he should. I don't ever really hate the fact that these characters exist, just the fact that they stick around too long and have a more active role than I feel they should. When it comes to the core cast and villains though, with a handful of exceptions, he absolutely nails it. Creating and realizing the essence and soul of these characters is something that I think Oda is very talented at. Even if he doesn't always use or implement his characters perfectly, he knows exactly how to make a likable one. One of the best things that I can say about One Piece in this regard is that many of my favorite characters are core protagonists, so I get to spend a lot of time with them. Zoro is my favorite character, and not only does he get introduced early, but it also feels like he's always doing something. Luffy spent pretty much the entire series somewhere in my top 5, and just about every member of his crew is probably somewhere in my top 20. Having characters that are this likable present for this much of the series is extremely important, and does a lot to help make getting through such a long series less painful. Now, having said all of that, even some of the core cast isn't handled perfectly. I don't want to get into every single main character that I have a problem with, but a good example of this sort of thing is Sanji. Now, I know Sanji is a very popular character. He's a lot of people's favorite character, so I won't go into detail here because I don't want to step on any toes. What I'll say, and if you've read or watched the series before, you already know what I'm talking about, is there is a running gag with Sanji that I personally think gets extremely annoying extremely quickly. Now, this gag aside, I think Sanji's great. If not for this, he'd be one of my favorite characters easily. As a matter of fact, there's a part of the series where it's toned down significantly, and it's great. It's spectacular. I thought that Oda finally realized that the joke got old almost as soon as he started telling it, but no, as soon as the arc is over, the gag comes back, and I hate it. Now, there's a good to fair chance, depending on the sort of person you are, that the gag I'm talking about won't bother you at all. Me personally, though, I think it's very, very annoying and distracting, not just because of the sort of gag it is, but also because of its frequency. Oda uses Sanji to tell the same joke like 30 million billion trillion times and it's just not that funny. This is related to a small overall issue that I have with Oda, which is that he tends to reduce some of his characters, particularly his side characters, to an exaggerated character trait or a running gag represented as an entire character. Of course, I'd be lying if I said that One Piece was the only shonen that does this. It's not even close. But I think I notice it more in this series than I notice it in other shonen series, at least the ones that I like anyway. Now, this is definitely not the end of the world. Sometimes these gags are actually pretty funny. It's just that they aren't always, and when they aren't, I think that they do more to detract from One Piece's characters than enhance them. Since I brought up Sanji though, I may as well go ahead and talk about something else. The most ad-friendly way I can say this is that Oda is a naughty boy. Like a couple of the other things that I've mentioned, this probably won't bother some of you. In fact, I don't think it will bother a lot of you. But there's a lot of fan service in One Piece. Like, a lot of fan service. And I mean like, a lot of fan service. Now, I know to some of you that's going to be a selling point, but I think it's a little obnoxious. It'd be one thing if it was done in moderation, but there are naked ladies popping up all over the place in One Piece. Like, just everywhere you look. Just a fair warning to any of you who may end up reading or watching One Piece, like at the airport or at McDonald's or in the break room at your job or something. Somebody may walk past you, catch a glimpse of your phone out of the corner of their eye. You might have some explaining to do if they ask you about it. Now, like I said about something else earlier, this is not a One Piece exclusive thing. This shows up in plenty of other shonen series. Plenty of other anime in general, actually. Oda's definitely not the worst manga author when it comes to this, but if you're new to the whole anime and manga thing, it'll probably catch you off guard if you don't know to expect it. Moving on from this, let's talk about pacing next, but not for too long since I already went over it a fair bit earlier in the video. I think this is the area that One Piece is the weakest in. The sense of progress is definitely toned down compared to something like Naruto or Dragon Ball. In those series, it feels like something exciting is constantly happening, but with One Piece, you definitely have to wait for the high points. Sometimes the chapters felt longer to me than they actually were, which was particularly frustrating because of how many more I still had left to go whenever this would happen. Like I said earlier, I think that one of Oda's main weaknesses is that he spends longer than he needs to on most of the things in One Piece. This is especially noticeable in the anime, but in both it and the manga, I think you could condense plenty of scenes, plot threads, and even arcs into less episodes, chapters, just overall time than they tend to take up. Like I've said about many other things in this video, it's not a deal breaker, and it's not usually even an egregious problem, but when it becomes noticeable, One Piece can turn into a real slog. It's weird because I know that Oda's definitely capable of being an efficient storyteller, he just doesn't seem to want to be. The reason I say this is because of something called the chapter cover serials, one of my favorite parts of One Piece. With most manga series, many of the chapters have a cover page featuring some sort of series-related artwork. This applies to One Piece too, and sometimes this artwork will be used to tell a multi-part story across multiple chapter covers. This is really cool, and it's a clever way to follow certain characters and plot threads without taking time away from the actual chapter to do it. Speaking of chapter layout, let's talk about Oda's paneling next. If you decide to watch the anime, this won't matter to you at all because it's an aspect of the story exclusive to the manga. All I'll say about his paneling is that I don't think it's very good, and I think that it actually tends to get worse as you get deeper into the series, not better like you'd expect. There's not a good sense of flow between each panel or even between each page sometimes, which makes One Piece hard to read. I had to reread certain pages or even certain series of pages many times throughout the course of reading One Piece. This is kind of at odds with what I just said, and it might seem like these two complaints aren't compatible with one another, but sometimes Oda condenses too much content into one panel. The reason this is a problem that's consistent with what I just said about his pacing is that a lot of the time, the text that's in these panels doesn't really need to be there. These are speech bubbles that you could cut completely without affecting the story. Sometimes you end up with a page or series of pages that's just full of text. It's not quite as bad as the infamous Hunter x Hunter page, but there's gonna be at least one or two chapters that make you feel like you're reading a novel rather than a comic book. These two things combined together can make it very difficult to push through certain sections of One Piece. This is what I was talking about earlier when I said that a lot of the arcs have low points. Typically, these low points come from Oda introducing too many characters or plot threads and insisting on following all of them. In Dressrosa, for example, I think that towards the middle and kind of close to the end, there are way too many scenes dedicated to following new characters that I didn't care about at all. A lot of these characters weren't major players or even anything close to that. They were very minor, and I don't even remember a lot of their names. With Oda, it seems like, and I'm not saying that this is the case, but it seems like he has to explore and implement any idea that comes to his head. He refuses to cut them no matter what. Of course, in some ways, this isn't a bad thing, and I'll get to that in a second. But a lot of the time, what this leads to is boring or at least pointless fluff. The first example that comes to mind of this is a guy named Gaimon. The crew meets him fairly early in the story, and he never shows back up ever again. Nothing particularly exciting happens on the island. It's just a brief interaction, and then the groups go their separate ways. Now, having said all that, Oda's typically very, and I mean very good at following up on loose plot threads. This is one of the main reasons, if not the main reason, One Piece has a reputation for good world building. If a character shows up and doesn't initially have a very active role in the story, or if something happens and doesn't really seem to go anywhere initially, chances are Oda's at least thinking about circling back to it. I'm not going to give any examples of this because doing so without spoiling anything is impossible. I'd like to say for the record though that this is one of my favorite things about One Piece, easily. There were many times where I was frustrated with Oda because I was like, why did we spend time with this? Or why did we spend time on that? Why did you make me read through this or read about this person? And then later in the story, that thing or that person or whatever ended up doing something really cool or interesting. Happens all the time. Now, there's probably a better way for him to handle some of these payoffs for sure, but he's really good at least doing it and typically does it pretty well. If you're a fan of well-realized and fleshed out worlds, there's a pretty good chance you'll be a big fan of One Piece. The world building comes at the cost of time though, like a lot of time. Pretty much every major character gets a multi-chapter flashback explaining their backstory. And again, sometimes you have to spend extended periods of time with characters that you don't care about like at all. In the end, it's typically worth it. Oda usually takes these things someplace interesting. The thing is, it can just take a while. Like I said at the beginning of the video, if nothing else, One Piece is extremely fun to talk about, and this is why. The last thing I'll discuss before I get out of here is the quality of One Piece's fights. On average, they're not like masterclass, but they're good. One Piece has some fights that are superb for sure, but I don't think that the action, choreography, etc. is on the same level as something like Naruto, Dragon Ball, or Jujutsu Kaisen. This kind of depends on how you engage with the series and where you're at in it though, because lately the anime has been gorgeous. Absolutely top-notch animation from Toei. Like seriously, pretty much every important moment in Wano is beautiful. So, final verdict on One Piece. I thought it was great. It's not the best or my favorite piece of media that I've ever engaged with, but it was definitely worth the time I put into it. It's got some problems, but I think these problems are pretty easy to ignore or at least set aside in the face of everything that I liked about it. If you ask me, I think you should at least give it a shot. And as always, thanks for watching. Swaikage out. Bye.